Welcome to DigiTalk.
After that chat talking about permissioned and permissionless blockchain, I thought it'd be good to show you guys the counterpoint. Permissionless is awesome, right? Because everyone can participate. On the other hand, whenever you're doing a transaction as a business with another business or an individual, there's often a need for strong identities while still wanting to have the benefits that blockchain can actually bring you. And I think that's the exciting point in history at the moment, where blockchain is moving far beyond just cryptocurrencies and going everywhere else in the world. So we believe that distributed ledger technology reduces the cost and time to market while usually speeding up any transaction. That was kind of the founding principle in which Corda, which is one of the solutions that provides this, was based on. Now, it all started with one of the people that was actually one of the founding engineers that worked closely with Satoshi, Mike Hearn. And Mike Hearn was, like I said, one of the early engineers on Bitcoin. And he's published all his conversations with him on his website. He has a long history there. I know the previous speaker worked closely with him as well. He's a great guy to work with. And after spending a whole bunch of time on Bitcoin, he went, I love the potential of this, but I do see some downsides that will make it hard to reach the full potential of what you might be able to do with this platform. And some of the things that he felt limited things is the lack of strong identity, the speed of transactions, which is something we just talked about before as well, where you could do 5 or 6, 7 transactions per second. Transactions will often take a couple of minutes to complete, which is great for currencies, but not great in every situation, right? And finally, whenever you want to use these kind of technologies to replace whatever you're doing currently, then integration becomes kind of an important thing as well. So we're looking for a solution that solves all of those things for you. So you need a strongly driven consensus algorithm, strong identity that can prove that the person you're transacting with is indeed a person that can be verified as being that identity. Privacy is critically important in many situations as well. Like, for instance, imagine if you had a bank account on blockchain. You wouldn't necessarily want everyone to be able to see every transaction you've ever done in your life, right? So privacy matters. Speed needs to fundamentally change as well. And of course, integration. And we feel that open source is also a critical part to building a lasting, impactful platform. The final challenge we gave ourselves is that it should be incredibly easy for everyone to be able to build solutions on this platform. So the goal we set ourselves, the milestone that we measure ourselves to, is that you should be able to build one app with 3 people in 3 days and completely solve a specific issue with that. Finally, the most exciting thing, one of the reasons why I'm working on this technology and this platform, is that innovation by its very nature is usually unpredictable. Like, some people of a certain age in the audience, like me, we might have seen the early days of the internet. And just after it was called ARPANET, we had Mosaic and then Netscape. And web pages in those days were basically just copies of paper brochures represented digitally. And that was all it was, a little graphic, a bit of text, and that was it, right? And it took a whole bunch of years to go from that point to what we called Web 2.0. That's kind of a dirty word now, but that was kind of the hype term back then, right? Web 2.0 meant that things were now almost application-like. Like Gmail was one of the earliest big examples of that, where it completely replaced the desktop application. And once that was figured out, desktop applications kind of became a second priority for many people, because most things were actually possible on the web. So that fundamentally changed the curve of innovation and the direction that innovation was going into. More recently, which I think more people here will have seen, for instance, you have smartphones. I remember when Steve Jobs first announced the iPhone in 2007, he went, here's this fantastic device, and you can look at web pages on it, which is exciting. And then we discovered that maybe web pages with roll over mouse menus didn't work that well on smartphones, right? And again, a few years passed and people experimented. And then things like Angry Birds happened and Snapchat. and Uber Eats and all these other experiences that are specifically built for that platform and couldn't have existed without that platform, but we never expected to see when we first released it. And I feel blockchain is very much in that moment in time where we're starting to see the first hints of where it is going. But I'm most excited about what we don't know yet, what we can't predict quite yet. So that is what we want to make possible. So I want to give you guys a very quick view over how this all works, right? Because you've seen a lot of talks about Bitcoin, Ethereum, Lightning networks, and everything else. So let me show you how a permissioned blockchain world works. In this case, I'm using Looney Tunes because, well, I like those characters, and why wouldn't they want to have their own blockchain network, right? So imagine that you have this blockchain network, and the specific thing that makes this different is that notary service there. Now, usually, whenever you have Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of those kind of situations, you need proof of work. And proof of work is what prevents malice attacks on the network. So you got Sybil attacks where you're impersonating other people and you try to pretend to be multiple personalities. You could try to become more than 51% of the miners and corrupt all the votes that happen on the network. All those things have to be prevented, and you do that in a normal Bitcoin and Ethereum, etc. world by making that very expensive. And by having that being very expensive, that means that it's not worth the effort to try to break that network, right? However, there's a cost associated, both in the cost of actually running all of those transactions in pure compute power. There's also a very heavy cost in the speed at which that can happen. However, you can solve that by using notaries. And notaries do a very clever thing where they look at a transaction between two parties, then they take a Merkle tree, which is signatures, hash signatures, of every value that is being changed. And using just those hashes, they can calculate if there is a double spend or any other kind of attack that is not valid on that network. So by using a notary pool, you do need a different kind of setup than you would have with a decentralized or permissionless network. But it does mean that you can now do about, well, the fastest that we've been able to replicate so far was working with Accenture, where they wanted to replay the stock market from the New York index. They took all the transactions, or NYSE, of a full day. They set up nodes for all the different parties that transacted with each other and replayed that full day of transactions. And this is one of the most transaction-full networks you could possibly simulate, right? Well, it's peaked over 20,000 transactions per second, replayed the entire day within 4 hours. And it was nowhere near the potential capacity for scalability. So that is what this solution buys you. Oh. That is not what it's supposed to do, is it? That looks better. So let's go back to the Looney Tunes. Say that Willy Coyote wants to buy a catapult, because of course he does. That he will send a request to Acme Corporation saying, dude, I need a catapult because this Roadrunner keeps escaping. I want to go as fast as him. Now, because we're in the blockchain world, we're talking about a transaction here, which is sort of one block in this situation. So there's a price, there's a seller, there's a buyer, and that, cool, it does work. And that is represented in the Corda world as a plain Java object. Now, this is what makes integration and programming these things incredibly easy, because this is a language that most people speak. And in fact, you could use any JVM language in this world, right? So if you want to write in Kotlin, Scala, or anything else, that is fully possible. So all this is a representation of the assets you want to transact. Now, that gets sent over, and Willy Coyote at that point says, well, obviously, I need to verify the stuff that you just sent me. So I'm going to run a contract over it, and the contract checks all the basics. I'm sure you're all familiar with that, if you're at all familiar with blockchain or cryptocurrency. But basically, all the rules that define if this something is valid or not happen in that contract. Finally, that state with both signatures of both parties who are transacting with each other gets sent over to the notary service, which uses that Merkle tree to figure out, have any of these properties been modified or spent before? And if everything checks out, it adds its signature as well, and that's the point where everything gets committed to the ledger for all the parties involved. Now, all that communication is what we would call a flow. Now, there are different names for this with different products. In the Corda space, it's a flow, which again is a plain Java object. Now, the nice thing about this is that whenever you're creating a platform using a solution like this, is that you can integrate it with whatever you want. Now, if you're building on Ethereum and you're using Solidity, you do not have these capabilities, right? Because everything is sandboxed in its entire small world. Whereas with this, if you want to integrate with your data warehousing system, Salesforce, or any other kind of backend that you're using, it's very easy to put into this. The other thing that you gain by being able to program the way that all these transactions happen is that you can be very opinionated about how they should work. For instance, imagine that you're building a gambling site. You might have a legal requirement to send every gambling transaction that happens to the legal authorities or the tax authorities. So you could very easily, in the flow, define that there's a person A and a person B, and a third party that is the tax authorities. That also is also a required signatory on a transaction. Or if you say, I'm a producer and I'm selling something to someone else, but I want my signature to be involved with every resale as well, you can define that in this flow as well. So you can be highly opinionated about how your network and how your transactions work. Now finally, this is based on a UTXO model, which Bitcoin and those networks use as well. And the basic premise of that is that whenever you have a transaction, there's an input state, and then there are output states. And everything that came before it is now marked as invalid. So you now have a new state for the person that's selling it with whatever remains, and there's a state that gets transferred to the party that is buying it. Now, what is special about this is that this enables that privacy as well, because Acme Corporation will have a full record of everyone it sold to, but Willie Coyote will only have insight in the transactions that he specifically was involved in and nothing else that happened on the network. Now, you can imagine that there are a lot of businesses out there for which this is a critical feature to have. Finally, because this does give you the freedom to build any kind of opinionated network you want, we have a few options of how you can put this to work. Now, again, the thing that is different here is that you're running your own nodes, there are notary services, and that is quite different from having this ephemeral network somewhere out there, right? You actually have to run your own software. And you have to run a network as well. And there's a few options. So first of all, we created what we call the Corda Foundation. Now, this is completely independent from any corporation, and the only mission that it has is to run a network where people can buy a certificate that proves their identity and their actual identity checks on it. And it runs a notary service as well. Like in this case, joining this will cost about $100. Every transaction takes about 1 cent or a little bit less than that if you get into the very high volumes. So that is one option where you can join an existing network. You just pay something for the basic services, and that works. Whenever you're developing stuff or experimenting, we have a test network, which is completely free, of course. And finally, you also have the option of building your own networks. And building your own networks is something that happens quite rarely, because it does take a whole bunch of infrastructure knowledge. But if you're saying, like, I'm going to build something that is a stablecoin solution, that I want to be independent of anything, those are very much options. In our case, we often see that happening with companies that do a lot of private financial transactions between countries, for instance. Now, as I said in the beginning, the most exciting thing is that the best is yet to come, right? The real innovation is still ahead. Now, one of the exciting things about these kind of permission networks is that we're seeing some glimpses of that happening in the future. Like last week, I was talking to a company in the Bay Area that is using this platform to track ethical food from suppliers all the way to consumption and every value add in the chain in between. I've been speaking with a car manufacturer who's collaborating with insurance companies and car repair companies to put what is usually in a little booklet where every repair is marked there and a little stamp put on it, which is highly subjective to fraudulent behavior, put that on the blockchain by having a little Corda node that runs in every car. And there's all these new companies and all these new business ideas, from green energy to cannabis supplies in the US and everything else, where the cheap cost of transactions without having to require lawyers and the old-fashioned kind of notaries is fundamentally changing what is possible in the business world. So I think that's pretty exciting. Thank you so much for your attention.